and welcome to Bad Book Club, where I, Jade, a silly goose with an English degree, read classic and popular literature so you don't have to. Hello, everyone. How is y'all's Tuesday? Is it going well? Did you have a good one? Mine went pretty well. We had a plumber come by and change a faucet, and it only took him like 3 hours. And there's a lot of banging. Is there normally like banging required when fixing I was literally sitting outside like, what is requiring this man to like bang my porcelain sink? I was like, what is going on? But that was my Tuesday. Hopefully you're also having a good one, because I'm excited to talk to you about Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. Not to be confused with Where the Crawdads Sing, which I covered last week. I accidentally chose these two titles together, so there's been a lot of singing in my house. And a lot of mixed up names, which I have been trying my hardest not to do. So if I mess up the title in here somewhere and I don't catch it, I'm really sorry. But this book is actually our first nonfiction read. So just so you guys know, I'm not actually the biggest fan of nonfiction. It's not that it's bad or anything like that. It's just that I am usually not interested in it. And I usually, like, when I read for, like, pleasure, not for, like, learning or education, I tend to gravitate more towards YA and fantasy because I just like fun, crazy novels with new worlds and ideas. And so usually in my free time, I don't read nonfiction. But this book is a reread for me. I read it in 2020, a little earlier before this, and I wanted to reread it for this podcast because halfway through, I realized it was nonfiction because I don't know what was going on with me. I just wasn't paying attention. I just knew this was a book by Maya Angelou, so I read it, and I did not think about the fact that she's known for her autobiographies. And I didn't make the connection because the main character's name is Marguerite, which I did not realize is Maya Angelou's real name. And I just didn't make the connection until like halfway through that it was nonfiction. And I wanted to read it again with that knowledge in my brain. Because the first time I was just reading for fun and I wasn't really paying attention. And I have this habit where I don't like to read the back cover if I can help it because I like surprises. So that's the story of why I'm redoing it here today on the podcast. But honestly, this book is so well written. It is a joy to read. I finished reading Where the Crawdads Sing, which I thought was really good, and it still is. But comparing it to Maya Angelou's prose is kind of like comparing like a kindergartner's poetry to Maya Angelou. Like, I don't know how to describe it. It's just that she's so like skilled in the art of writing that it's almost ludicrous. Like, I don't even know how to describe it to you. She even doesn't use like crazy words all the time, but she's just so capable. So 10 out of 10 would recommend this book to anyone with a free weekend who wants to learn more about her life. It is not a boring read, I promise. It is so interesting. And you're going to find out just now. But let's talk a little bit about Maya Angelou because I am super impressed with her life and I actually didn't know too much about her. Are you ready? So Maya Angelou's life is like insane, and I thought it was insane after reading this book, but then I thought it was even more insane when I read up about her. She has had like a crazy amount of weird, odd jobs, including like fry cook. She was a sex worker. She was a nightclub performer. She's been an actress, writer, director, and producer of plays, movies, public television programs. She was a correspondent in Egypt and Ghana during the decolonization of Africa. She was a Reynolds professor at like Wake Forest University. She was in the civil rights movement. She worked with Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. In 1993, she recited her poem On the Pulse of the Morning at Bill Clinton's inauguration, making her the first poet to do so since JFK had Robert Frost to do it. She is so crazy cool and respected, and she's done so many awesome things in her life, and I don't have a ton of time to talk about her, but if you're interested, I'm about to tell you the beginning of her life story. This is one of her 7 autobiographies, and I'm probably going to read the later ones too, because the first one just blew me away. It only covers her first 17 years, which is insane, but it's actually a pretty short read, so I'm going to tell you about it. And then if you want to know more about her, feel free to look her up because she's amazing. So I'm just going to jump right in. Let's get started. So the book actually starts with a prologue. That's this short little section that would be kind of It's kind of odd when I say it to you, but it's written well enough that it's not that odd when you read it. But basically, she is reciting a poem in church, and she doesn't remember the words, and in a panic, she runs out and she like pees herself. I'm assuming it's maybe her earliest memory, just because she put it before the book even starts. So that would be my assumption. I don't know if that's true, but that would be my assumption. And like I said, it sounds weird when I say it to you, but it's not that weird in the book. It's just written really well. Anyway, let's start with actual chapter 1. Chapter 1 is really short, but it's written really well. It's just supposed to be an introduction to the story where her mother and father got divorced and sent her and her brother Bailey on a train to her grandmother in Stamps, Arkansas to live with her. And here is the little intro bit. Let's see if I can open it. When I was 3 and Bailey 4, we had arrived in the musty little town wearing tags on our wrists which instructed, to whom it may concern, that we were Marguerite and Bailey Johnson Jr. from Long Beach, California, en route to Stamps, Arkansas, to Mrs. Annie Henderson. So that's how it starts. It's very matter of fact. And their trip, she describes, their trip, people took pity on them, gave them like some fun food and stuff. They're like, oh, like poor little babies and stuff like that. And they arrived. And she talks about how this was a time in North America where Black children were often sent home from northern towns to live with southern grandmothers after the northern towns reneged on their like promise of inclusion and stuff like that. This book is full of race and identity and like cities and family and the effect of a people and culture in a place. It's very present. She says that her grandmother owned a store in Stamps, Arkansas, which is actually a big deal. It was called the General Store, and they lived with their grandmother and their uncle in the back of the store, and they would work in the store and sell to the customers. And each year she mentions that the people of town were often cotton pickers, and it would be picking season, and they'd come by and the men would stop for lunch. She talks about how difficult the lives of the cotton pickers in town were, and I really like this little section, so I'll read it to you. Brought back to the store, the pickers would step out of the backs of trucks and fold down, dirt disappointed, to the ground. No matter how much they had picked, it wasn't enough. Their wages wouldn't even get them out of debt to my grandmother, not to mention the staggering bill that waited on them at the white commissary downtown. The sounds of the new morning had been replaced with grumbles about cheating houses, weighted scales, snakes, skimpy cotton, and dusty rows. In later years, I was to confront the stereotyped picture of gay, song-singing cotton pickers with such inordinate rage that I was told even by fellow blacks that my paranoia was embarrassing. But I had seen the fingers cut by the mean little cotton bowls, and I had witnessed the backs and shoulders and arms and legs resisting any further demands. Maya Angelou's writing is just so amazing. So I'm going to be giving you little excerpts in this episode, as I did last episode, because otherwise you won't get the full feeling. So the next bit, she just tells us about her Uncle Willy and a little bit about the store. Her Uncle Willy, she lives with him. She mentions that he is disabled. He has, kind of a sagging left side of his maybe face and a small hand. And I imagine he has a limp of some kind because she mentions a cane. She does mention, too, that in the store, if they were doing anything wrong, he would kind of shove them toward this, like, stove that was, like, hot. And they never touched the stove. It was just, like, the threat of being pushed toward it was, like, a punishment, which is, like, very strange for me to read because I've never had anything like that happen to me. And upon reading, I was like, what? But it's very clear in this chapter that she loves her Uncle Willy. She mentions that, he's a proud man. She never saw him pretend not to be disabled, except one time where when she came home from school, he was standing behind the counter with just these people going through town pretending to be very normal, and he gave her like a beseeching look to like please not give him away, and she said she would have pretended to be his daughter because she loved him like that. And then she says that it was around this time that she fell in love with Shakespeare, which is very cute. She and Bailey were apparently very avid readers, which makes sense because she's a writer. The next bit is describing an event that happened in town once. She starts by saying that she used to really enjoy working in the store. She found a lot of purpose there. She liked it a lot. But she mentioned one day while she was feeding the chickens that the town sheriff came by on his horse, like this big white man who scared her, and said that that day a black man had done something to a white woman in the town, and that Uncle Willy better lay low because, quote unquote, the boys will be around later. And then he rode off. And so Marguerite, or Maya, I'll just call her Maya from now on. Maya tells her grandmother, who they call Mama, about that, and she tells the kids to knock out the wooden divider in their box for the storing of onions and potatoes, and they put Uncle Willy in there and put like potatoes and onions on top of him and then close the box. And she mentions that she's really grateful that the boys, which by the way are the Ku Klux Klan, which is insane, didn't come by that night because she thinks they would have heard him because he was like moaning in agony and probably fear for the night. And that's just where the chapter ends, which is like so heavy, but it gives you the racial kind of feeling of the town and of the time and, you know, what was at risk and what her life was like. And I think it's important, but it's chapter 3 and we're already into some crazy material. The next chapter is all about Bailey. So she starts off by telling us about a man in her town named Mr. McElroy, who is the town's independent black man. And then she switches to Bailey. So I imagine she pictures him like this independent, like successful figure in her life, which is very adorable. She obviously loves him and idolizes him. She describes this memory of how he used to steal pickles right out from Uncle Willy's nose and how he put them in their pockets and they would run away from the store with like pickle juice like going down his legs and stuff like that. It's a very vivid and happy memory for her. She obviously loves Bailey. It's very cute. She then tells us about how her town used to prepare every year by preparing ham and sausage and curing it and putting it in cans for the year because they didn't have refrigerators. But her grandmother thought it was important for them to have fresh meat in their diet, and twice a year she would send Bailey and her to the white part of town for some meat from the butcher. And she talks about how she perceives white people, and to her when she was a kid they didn't seem real. So it's this really interesting passage about how to her the real parts of her town were Mr. McElroy and her mom and Uncle Willy and Bailey, and white folks weren't real people to her. And that part of town is like a little frightening, which would track, I think, if I was like 5. On the heels of this revelation, Maya tells us how her mama instilled in her and Bailey the need to be clean. It was very important to her mama, who was a very biblical woman, and she would have them wash themselves every night, and she would inspect their feet, and if they weren't clean, she'd hit them with a switch, which was usually kept by their room for emergencies, which made me laugh just a little bit because why would a switch be like in need of an emergency? Like, but I don't know. Anyway, she also mentions that impudence was very terrible in her household. You addressed adults by Mrs. or uncle or aunt, never by their first name and stuff like that. And she also mentions that the poor white trash, which is spelled po white trash, all one word, is always impudent to her family. They call her Uncle Willy, and it amazes her because they live on her grandmother's land for free because they're the po white trash. And she says that there was this one memory she has where after raking the front lawn and standing with her grandmother, the poor white trash girls came in front of their house and her grandmother sent her inside behind the screen door. But the girls mocked her grandmother and her grandmother was just humming a hymn to herself, like trying not to like engage, obviously. And the girls would mock her. They would copy her stance. They made faces at her. They were dirty and terrible. They did like puppet dances, like, hey, Annie, because that was her name. And then this one girl specifically does a handstand and she's not wearing any underwear and just flashes her grandmother. And her grandmother still doesn't react. And Maya's crying because she is watching this powerful woman she sees as her grandmother be embarrassed by these white people who she hates. But eventually the girls leave and her grandmother is obviously happy and she feels like she won something, and Maya sees that and she comes in and sees Maya and says, go and wash your face, hun. And then afterwards Maya makes a new design in the ground with her little rake and it's lots of hearts and it's very cute, and her grandmother says, oh, that's really pretty, Marguerite, and goes back inside. It's the cutest little chapter. It's heartbreaking, but it's also so cute. The next chapter is my favorite so far because it's so funny. So she talks about how this man, Reverend Howard Thomas, used to stay with them every 3 months on a Saturday so that he could do Sunday church service. And she says that he was really gross. She and Bailey did not like him. He was fat and obese and ate all the good food at their dinner. And then in the mornings when they would wake up and her mom would make them like a really big spread so that they could go to church all day, that his prayer would be so long that all the food would get cold before they could eat it, which is so sad. But the funny part is that she describes the Sunday church service one day when Sister Monroe came in. Apparently Sister Monroe usually is not able to attend because she doesn't live nearby. So when she does attend, she is very vocal. And once before this day, she had run up to their reverend and said, preach it, and was like yanking on him and like tackled him to the ground and did all these funny things. And so after that, every time her brother Bailey said, preach it, she would start laughing. And at this particular service, Sister Monroe was starting to get very vocal. And while she was getting vocal, Bailey kept leaning over to Maya to say, I say, preach it, under his breath. And they were close to laughing. And Mama did not allow laughing in church. But then this happens. Are you ready? Then suddenly, like a summer rain, Sister Monroe broke through the cloud of people trying to hem her in and flooded up to the pulpit. She didn't stop this time, but continued immediately to the altar, bound for Elder Thomas, crying, I say, preach it. Bailey said out loud, hot dog and damn, and she's going to beat his butt. But Reverend Thomas didn't intend to wait for that eventuality, so as Sister Monroe approached the pulpit from the right, he started descending from the left. He was not intimidated by his change of venue. He continued preaching and moving. Just as the elder opened his mouth, pink tongue waving, and said, Great God of Mount Nebo, Sister Monroe hit him on the back of his head with her purse twice. Before he could bring his lips together, his teeth fell. No, actually, his teeth jumped out of his mouth, which is so funny. And she has this moment where Bailey and her burst out laughing, and she pees herself because they're laughing so hard. And Uncle Willy gets so upset, he takes them outside the church and whips them, quote unquote. I imagine he's spanking them. And the whole time they're yelling and screaming, and then the Reverend has to ask them to please quiet down. And that was their favorite, like, little memory of church, and that if they mentioned preach it, they would just break down into giggles. It's a hilarious memory, very cute. The next chapter is all about Mama. It's about how she married 3 men and only once had her husband ever visited them. And Uncle Willy and Bailey had to stay home from a church service to make sure he didn't steal anything. And after some food, he left. And she says that she saw her grandmother only her power and strength. That's all she saw. She was taller than any woman, and her hands were huge, and she was beautiful, and she was just so powerful and strong, which is so cute. And she used to lead hymns in church like every Sunday, and she was always like surprised by it because she never expected anything from the church, which is like a super cute memory. And she also describes to us that she is the owner of the store, so she has respect in town, and she was once referred to as Mrs. Henderson by, in court. Apparently a black man had once stayed in her store for the night while he was on the run. And so when she was called to court and the judge asked for Mrs. Henderson, he did not realize that he was calling forward a black woman because she was owner of the store. So he assumed that she would be white. And while apparently the white people found that to be very funny, the black people in town thought that to just be a testament to her respect and her pride and success. Speaking of her mama's successfulness, she now jumps into how the Depression affected stamps. So it affected stamps just like everyone else. Everyone had a really tough time, but her mama was able to keep the store afloat by trading food for welfare food. So she was still able to sell the items in her store for some sort of profit and make some sort of business sense of it. And it was very smart of her to do so. This chapter also describes how her father and mother once sent them Christmas gifts for the first time, and her dad sent a picture of himself, which is so egotistical, and her mom sent a tea set and a doll. And the 2 kids, Bailey and her, were really upset by this because up until now, they were kind of able to pretend that their parents didn't exist. But now their parents had sent them gifts and just proven that they are not with their parents, and they don't know why they were sent away, and they don't really understand what's going on. And their mama doesn't quite get it, and she's like, you guys are so ungrateful. What are you doing? Come inside. And Bailey's like, well, maybe the gifts are good. Maybe it's a sign that they're going to forgive us soon, which is just heartbreaking. Speaking of her parents, her father randomly arrives in town one day with absolutely no warning. She describes him as the first cynic she ever met and says that he's kind of an awful person, like not a great guy. He mocks her during dinner for like how she's cutting her meal and her elbows are kind of moving, and he's like, are you gonna flap away? And everyone laughs, and it's really mean. Oh, it's so sad. And then after a while, he says that he's going to take the kids with him to California. Her mama makes them all new clothes with lots of love, and I think she's a little sad to see them go. I can tell in the words, and I think that Maya can tell through her actions that she's gonna see them. And she says that there's always like a deep love over everything mama did that she never really saw, which is such a cute line. But basically they drive to town with Dad, and it's kind of a terrible drive. He's only talking to Bailey. She's squished in the back with their boxes. He says they're going to see their mom, which they're both like, oh, we had no idea we were going to see our mom today. And they're both kind of afraid. And she tries speaking to him in Pig Latin, Bailey, and says, do you think he's kidnapping us? Her father responds in Pig Latin and says, who would want to kidnap you? Do you think you're the Lynchburg children? And it's really mean to like talk to maybe a 10-year-old that way. Like, what are you doing? And they arrive to town and they meet their mom, who's a beautiful woman, and Bailey is immediately in love, and Maya finds herself kind of lonely, and their dad just like leaves. So he's gonna take them with him, but then he heads out of Dodge, not his problem anymore. In the next bit, Maya describes her grandmother Baxter to us, who is almost basically white, she says. And she lives in St. Louis, fell in love with their grandfather, had kids, whatever. She describes the city of St. Louis as being completely different and talks about the food a lot. There's like thin sliced ham here. They put lettuce on bread. It's crazy. And she also talks about the school and the teachers, how school is different because the teachers are like really uppity and kind of rude and mean. And she talks about how living with her mother was so interesting, and her mother's like a beautiful spirit. They'd sometimes meet her at this club called Louie's after school, and she would dance for them, and they just loved her. She talks about her uncles, and she learns all about family loyalty. Her uncles have they're tough and they have tempers, and they're kind of like crime bosses in St. Louis, which is really interesting. She talks about the story, how someone cursed at her mom once, and the uncles tracked him down, surrounded him, and then let her mom like beat him up, which is insane. And Maya talks about how she got her name, which is how Bailey refers to her as my sister, Maya's sister. So they call her Maya, which is very cute that she got her name from her brother, who she loves. And then she discusses how her mom was currently dating a man named Mr. Freeman. Now, just to give you all a warning, Mr. Freeman is not a very nice man, and he does some things to Maya that are terrible, awful. So I will tell you what happens, but please keep in mind that I'm just giving you a brief warning in case you are uncomfortable with this topic, because it is just bad. Anyway, one morning she wakes up after sleeping with her mom, and Mr. Freeman is there, and her mom's gone, supposedly to do errands of some kind. And in this moment, Mr. Freeman, quote unquote, holds her. And presumably in this moment, there's no delicate way to put it, but presumably he's holding on to her as he is touching himself. So she's not hurt in this situation. And in fact, she's a little confused because this is her first time anyone has ever held her or hugged her. And she likes the physical affection and love that this presents to her because she's so young. She doesn't understand what's going on. And at the end of this situation, he pours some water on the bed and tells her that she wet the bed. And she doesn't understand because she didn't wet the bed. And he says, if you tell anyone about this, I will kill Bailey. And she's like, whoa, why would you kill my brother? She's like, I definitely won't tell anybody. And he said, okay. And then she mentions another time where maybe a week or two later, she, wanting a hug, goes to sit on his lap and gives him a hug again. And the same situation happens where he touches himself and then leaves. Now, the next bit gets even darker, if possible. Basically, one afternoon, maybe a couple months later, Mr. Freeman asks her to go get milk at the store, and when she returns, he asks her to come towards him, and she says no. Now that she's older, she understands that she's uncomfortable by the previous situation, and she says no, and he says, he threatens her, he turns up the radio, and basically, it's very disjointed because she's trying to describe this situation in a way that represents how she remembers it, which is obviously disconnected because this happened to her when she was maybe 8. But essentially, Mr. Freeman rapes her as an 8-year-old, which is just awful, awful terrible. This is like such a shock to me when I read it, because I had no idea that Angelou's life had happened this way. This is insane. But that is what happens. And she comes to in kind of like a stupor while he washes her in the shower and apologizes because he, quote unquote, didn't mean to hurt her. And she says that she tries to go to the library that day, but like she can barely walk and she's hurting and she feels sick. And that night she lays in bed and her mom and Bailey are really concerned about her. And they think it might be the measles, which is a little bit of a funny scene because she's like, better he gets it now than later. And I'm like, the measles? But and anyway, her mom is very sweet and brings her some soup, and a doctor comes to take her temperature. But when the doctor touches her, she obviously panics because there's a man touching her. And Bailey and her mom kind of pick her up and comfort her. And while they're comforting her, they change her sheets. And while they're changing her sheets, the underwear that she was wearing the previous day fall onto the floor, which is evidence of what has occurred to her. And she's taken to the hospital where her mom and Bailey ask her who hurt her. They know now what has happened. And she tells them that she can't tell them because otherwise he'll kill Bailey. And Bailey says, I won't let him kill me. And in this sweet moment of utter trust in her brother, she says, well, if Bailey says it, then it has to be true. And she tells them it was Mr. Freeman. Time moves forward and she is in court. She is being questioned on the stand about Mr. Freeman and what he did or did not do to her. They ask her what clothes he was wearing and she doesn't remember. They ask her, like what happened, and she doesn't remember. And they're like, well, did it even happen? And she's like, obviously very uncomfortable, very shy. She's already a shy child to begin with, and this is not a great situation. And they ask her too, they say, has this ever happened before? And in her mind, the previous moments in time with Mr. Freeman were her fault and not his. And so she thinks that if she tells them about those previous times, that she will no longer be like trusted and they'll think the whole situation was her fault. So she says no. And the lie, it hurts her little heart. And she stands up and yells at him in court and says he's like a mean old man. And eventually they're able to calm her down. And he's given a year and a day in prison. But before he can make it to prison, he's found dead. A police officer comes to their home and tells Grandmother Baxter that he has been found dead. And Grandmother Baxter's like, well, what can you do? Good riddance. And she has this moment where she thinks this is all her fault. She lied, and therefore now a man is dead because actually it was her fault, which it wasn't. But she thinks so. And God hates her and she's going to hell now. And anyone she talks to, she'll just take with her. Even she, though, cannot corrupt Bailey. So Bailey is the only safe person in her life for her. And she decides that she'll just stop talking, which is a big choice, but she decides not to talk anymore. They all assume that this is just, obviously trauma from the event. But after a couple weeks, a doctor says that she is now perfectly healthy, and her family starts to wonder why she's not talking now. It's like they don't know at all that she might still be reeling from this episode. And they're like, get over it, whatever. Why does she not talk? And after some time, she and Bailey are sent back to Stamps. She's not exactly sure why, but she thinks it might have to do with just her attitude, because she says no one wants to be around a morose child. But she and Bailey get sent back. Bailey is utterly heartbroken. She doesn't really care. I get the feeling definitely in the next maybe just half of this book that she's just depressed. She obviously is a child that youth has been shuttered and taken away from her. So it's this moment of the book is very dark, and it's so surprising to know that we're not even halfway through. This is not even half of the story done, which is crazy. This book so far is just so well written. That's what I think when I'm reading it. I read it again for the second time, and it was still what I was thinking. Her writing is just so impressive. She's just so vivid, and even in the really dark parts of the book, I don't want to stop reading. I'm still interested in to see what's going on, and it's crazy to me that this was her life. Her life is just so intensely different from mine. I did not grow up in the 1940s with my Southern Black grandmother. They make their own clothes and they don't have toilets, and they have to cure the meat because they don't have refrigerators. This morning I was like, oh no, where'd I put my iPhone charger? So our lives are just so different. I think this story is so interesting because this perspective is not one I've ever come across, and it is so well done. So let's get back to the story, to the interesting bits, won't we? They arrive back in Stamps, and she and her brother are basically celebrities because they're from the big city where so many people have not been. And her brother talks enough for the both of them, describing about the refrigerators and the city and the buildings, and there's toilets in every house, and it's just a crazy different world, he says, and he spins a big yarn or whatever it's called. And she wonders if people in her life now know about what happened in, St. Louis. And she thinks her Uncle Willy might, but she doesn't ever want him to look at her with pity, and it seems like he tries not to. She mentions that colors and sounds are really dull, and she mentions that the town understands her as being tender-hearted, so they don't really look too closely at that. She says she was depressed basically until she met a lady named Mrs. Bertha Flowers. She just loves her. She has this air that she walks on. There's a beautiful excerpt I'll read for you. She had the grace of control to appear warm in the coldest weather, and on Arkansas summer days it seemed she had a private breeze which swirled around, cooling her. She was thin without the taut look of wiry people, and her printed voile dresses and flowered hats were as right for her as denim overalls for a farmer. She was our side's answer to the richest white woman in town. So she's just obviously beautiful, graceful lady, and one day she comes to the store and asks Maya to carry some groceries back to her house for her. She mentions to her mama that she likes the stitching of her dress, and her mama makes her take it off so she can show her the inside arm seams, which really embarrasses Maya, but is pretty cute on her mom, just being adorable. And she walks with Miss Flowers to her house, where Mrs. Flowers gives her afternoon tea and cookies and talks to her about reading and the voice. She says, "Look, words are more important than you think they are." And I'll read that bit to you too. "Words mean more than what is set down on paper. It takes the human voice to infuse them with the shades of deeper meaning." So it's just so cute. She tells her that she should read, and she gives her a book of poems and says, "Please memorize these so that you can read them to me next time." And Maya runs home full of excitement and with extra cookies because this woman has taken a liking to her, a woman that she's grown up admiring, and it doesn't occur to her that maybe her mama asked Miss Flowers to speak to her, which I bet she did, because why would she? But it's so sweet of her mama to do that. And she gets home and she says, "Hey, Bailey, by the way, here are some cookies from Mrs. Flowers." And her mama comes in very upset and says, "What did you say?" And they're both very confused. And they're like, "I said, here's some cookies." And she said, "No, what did you say?" And Bailey's like, "She was just giving me cookies." And she's like, "I'm not talking to you, Bailey. I'm talking to Maya. What did you say?" And she said, "I said, Bailey, by the way." And she's like, "That's what I thought." And she grabs a switch, which is like a tree branch, and whips them both inside. And they're crying and they don't understand. And she says later that night, she asked why that had happened. And her mama told her that "by the way" is a Christian phrase of saying "by Jesus' way," and no one takes the God's name in vain in her house, which is just insane. I was reading that bit for the first time and I was like, whoa, what did she say? It was crazy. I had no idea what in that sentence had made her mom so upset. And I had no idea that phrase is based on a biblical phrase. And it just shows you her mama's piety and her seriousness about her piety. But it was a crazy moment. And it's a bit odd for her to end this chapter on that note, but I think it's supposed to set apart the two types of love that she's received. She's received tough love, but she's also received kind love. At almost more, this chapter is about Mama rather than Mrs. Flowers, because it shows that Mama reached out to Mrs. Flowers to give her help and was willing to ask someone to help her, which I'm sure is not easy for her to do. And then at the same time, she is strict and she is willing to discipline the kids in matters that are important to her. So I think this was such an interesting chapter. In the next bit, we move forward in time, and Maya tells us about kind of her first job. It's not a job per se, because she's still too young. I'd guess maybe she's 12 or 13 here. But she says that this functioned as her finishing school, quote unquote, because she went to be a maid for a woman named Mrs. Cullinan. Mrs. Cullinan was this really obese woman, white lady, and she was never able to have kids. And her husband had 2 kids out of wedlock with another woman, and she knew those kids, and she felt really bad for Mrs. Cullinan and kind of pitied her. So she came to work work early and left late and really tried to make up for her barrenness, quote unquote, which is like such a funny thing to say. In the book, Maya really is excellent at giving us the point of view of a child who like doesn't have any context for what she's thinking. So in moments where she feels triumphant, she is very obvious in that feeling. And in moments where she feels scared, it's also very obvious. So in this moment, obviously, she's just in her own world. She's a kid. So I think that if you honestly didn't know that, you might not like her character very much. But I do know that she's just trying to relate to me the childlike ability to center everything around yourself, right? And that's just kind of how it goes. She said that one day, Miss Cullinan had a woman over, and the woman said, "Oh, this is Margaret, my new maid." And her visitor said, "Oh, well, that's so long. You should just call her Mary." And Maya's like, "That is not my name." By the way, in the book, I've been calling her Maya so far because it's easier, but it seems like people have different names for her constantly. She's Marguerite, Margaret, Riddy a couple times, Maya. People call her like lots of different things, but apparently she is not okay with Mary because no one has called her that. Mrs. Cullinan's main maid, her name is Miss Glory, and she said when she was younger her name was Hallelujah, but they called her Miss Glory for short because Hallelujah is too long. And Maya goes home absolutely enraged that anyone would try to rename her out of convenience. And the next day, she talks to Bailey and comes up with this plan. She goes to Mrs. Cullinan's favorite dishes and carries them toward her for lunch and drops them and shatters them. And Mrs. Cullinan comes in like so upset, just crying hysterically. And Miss Glory runs in saying, "What happened? What's wrong? Did the dishes break?" And Miss Cullinan's like, "Yes, they did." And Miss Glory's like, "Who was it? Was it Mary?" And Miss Cullinan's like, "Yeah, no, her name is Margaret. It was Margaret." So she now says her full name. And she throws like a broken dish at Miss Glory. Maya mentions that this whole time she made sure to leave the front door open so that everyone would hear this happen. And then she leaves. So she is not working there anymore. And I really like that scene because it shows that she is such like a rebel and not a troublemaker, but someone who's willing to stand up for herself even in small ways. So she's such a fun character to read. Next, Maya tells us a time that Bailey came home late and missed his curfew. She and Mama assumed the absolute worst and were terrified, but they walked together to meet him on the way home. And because he's late, Uncle Willy, whips him. And he tells Maya that he was late because he went to the movies and he saw Mother. But it wasn't her, it was just an actress, but she looked exactly like Mother. And Maya understands that he stayed late to watch it again just because they were just so happy to see her. And they go to see another movie when that actress comes back to the movie theater. And on the way home, she's really happy because she got to see a woman who looks like her mother. But something's up with Bailey, he's upset. And she says he dashes in front of a train and goes to the other side. And she's like screaming and wailing like, what, is he okay? And then the train is gone and he's like, "What were you yelling for? Let's go home." And it's very bizarre. The next chapter is a description of people in the store listening to a boxing match between the Brown Bomber, or Joe Louis, and some other white guy that I don't know. I don't follow boxing. But Joe Louis wins. The Brown Bomber wins. And Maya Angelou just talks about how proud everyone is in the store because a black man is now the strongest man in the world and how they're all so happy about it. Next, we move to a church scene. They're going to a revival with this, I guess it's all the churches in town come together for this big revival in a big tent one weekday afternoon. And she describes the feeling really well, so I'm going to read it to you. Teenagers enjoyed revivals as much as adults. They used the night outside meetings to play at courting. The impermanence of a collapsible church added to their frivolity, and their eyes flashed and winked while the girls giggled little silver drops in the dusk, while the boys postured and swaggered and pretended not to notice. This whole chapter basically describes the service. It's very spiritual and vivid. It's very dreamlike, the singing. He talks about charity. She talks mainly in this chapter, I think, about the relationship between oppressed peoples and God, because she talks about how the people who have had a really rough day and are really downtrodden come to church and they feel like they have heaven waiting for them. And they're just waiting for whenever Lord will show up and take them to their just reward for working so hard on earth. She expresses some pity, I think, for that message, but I think she still even feels that herself, because she talks about how on the walk home, they're all feeling really happy. And then they start passing through town where, like, you know, there are gambling dens and they all start to lose that shininess. So the relationship between herself and God is something that's always in question in the book. I mean, it's a coming of age novel, so she's trying to figure out who she is. And something too that I noticed in this chapter, like the most probably, is the language. And maybe you heard it in the excerpt, but her language usage and the words she uses start getting more intense as the book goes along, which I love. It's maybe my favorite thing about the writing is that the younger she is, the simpler her language is, and the older she gets, the more purposeful and like the vocabulary gets bigger and her phrases get better and her thinking gets deeper, and it just reflects her age, which I think is so impressive. So let's move on. The next chapter describes a picnic, a summer picnic that Stamps holds every year, and she says that everyone brings food and they fish and they fry the fish and they eat the fish and all the kids play, and she's still feeling kind of lonely. I think this point in her life she's still a little depressed, detached from the world. And this is where she makes her first friend. So she goes to a little field and she sits down, stares into the sky, feels like she's falling into it. And she has a person come up to her named Louise, and she says, "What are you doing?" And she doesn't quite answer. And she also sits down and she says, "Oh, I was falling into the sky too." And immediately Maya likes her because they're both enraptured by the sky. And it's a very cute, childlike passage, and they spin around in the field together and they make fast friends, which is very adorable. And then the chapter fast forwards in time a little bit to a moment right before Valentine's Day when Maya receives a love note from a boy named Tommy Valden, and he says, you know, like, "You're really beautiful, I'd like to be your Valentine." And she shows it to Louise, and Louise is like, "Well, do you want to be his Valentine?" And she's like scared. She's like, "No, not again." And Louise is like, "What do you mean again?" And she doesn't say anything, but they tear up the message because they don't want to deal with it. And then on Valentine's Day, Tommy says a note to the whole class. I guess they have some sort of delivery system and the teacher's reading notes. And she says, "To Marguerite, I saw you rip up my letter. I don't think you meant to hurt my feelings, but to me, you're still my Valentine." And she likes him after that. She gets all shy and giggly and nothing ever becomes of it, but it's kind of like her first love that's not tainted. The next chapter is about Bailey's sexual awakening with a girl named Joyce. She comes over and they hang out and they play this game called House, and she basically sleeps with him for the first time. And Maya is actually really scared for Bailey because she knows and she thinks it will hurt him because it hurt her. So she's like, "No, don't." And Joyce is like very weirdly threatening with her. And she leaves, and Bailey experiences his kind of first love for the first time. And Joyce is obviously not a very good girl. She only sleeps with him when he supplies her with food because she's really poor. And one day she just disappears, which kind of breaks Bailey's heart. The next chapter is this kind of like gothic scene. If you don't know what the gothic is, it's anything supernatural and like, oh, Jane Eyre and all these things. And I say Jane Eyre because one night during a storm, she is reading Jane Eyre, and they close the store and they go home and they have a visitor. His name is George Taylor, and he's visiting because his wife died not too long ago, and he's been going around town for free meals if possible because he's obviously hurt. And basically he comes in for dinner and he describes a ghost story about how the previous night he had heard his wife speaking to him about how she wants children, and the whole time he saw this baby angel. And it's freaking out Maya and her brother, and eventually after he leaves, things quiet back down and get normal. This chapter is supposed to show, I think, simultaneously where she is in her literary life reading the Gothic, and also give some input about when she realized death was like a thing, because she mentions a memory of going to this man's funeral, like this man's wife's funeral, and how she realized that death is kind of inevitable, you know? So this was her death awakening right after Bailey's sexual awakening. So they're on different paths of life. But you know what path of life they're both on? Graduation. She's graduating from 8th grade, just like Bailey did the year before her. And she is so excited. The whole school is abuzz. I think this is the first chapter where we finally see her leaving her depression and tragedy behind. She's growing up. She feels smarter. She feels prettier. She says that she was close to being valedictorian valedictorian, but instead Henry Reed was Victorian. She mentions on the day of that she gets gifts. Her grandparents give her a Mickey Mouse watch that they ordered specifically for her. Her friend Louise makes her some handkerchiefs, and Bailey gives her this like leather-bound book of poetry by Poe, which is very sweet. At the graduation, she is a little worried actually that something's not going to go right because they're singing the national anthem, and then they skip what she calls the, so it has the N-word in it, so I'm not going to say it, but she calls it the Black People National Anthem. Apparently it's a poem written by James Weldon Johnson. Anyway, she says that because they're rushed through that, they're told that Mr. John Levy will speak, but he has to go soon. So these two white guys walk on stage. One of them like sits on the principal. Did he not see him or something? And they praise the white school nearby for how smart they are, and then they praise this school for how good they are at sports. And it makes everyone so sad because she's like, oh, suddenly all our hopes and dreams for the future are crushed and given limitations by this speech. And she's like, so upset. She's being like very dramatic, and she's saying everyone should just be dead, like be the same. And she's obviously upset until they all receive their diplomas and sit down. And then Henry, in the middle of his speech, turns around and sings their version of the national anthem. And it is so sweet. I'll read it to you. I looked up and saw Henry Reed, the conservative, the proper, the A student, turn his back to the audience and turn to us, the proud graduating class of 1940, and sing, nearly speaking. Lift every voice and sing, till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. It was the poem written by James Weldon Johnson. It was the music composed by J. Rosamond Johnson. Out of habit, we were singing it. Our mothers and fathers stood in the dark hall and joined the hymn of encouragement. A kindergarten teacher led the small children onto the stage, and the buttercups and daisies and bunny rabbits marked time and tried to follow. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died, yet with steady beat have not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers sighed. It is the most uplifting moment, and she ends the chapter talking about how Black poets have so affected the Black community and lent them strength when they needed it. Next in the life story of Maya Angelou, we're told that all the candy she has stolen from the store has led to a bad case of 2 cavities. Her teeth are basically rotting out of her head. She said she has the worst toothache ever. And finally, her grandma says, we have to get you to a dentist. And she says the black one is really far away. So for right now, we'll just go to Dr. Lincoln because he owes me a favor. And he's the white dentist near town. And they walk together to the dentist, and she is so upset, and she thinks she's going to die. It's kind of funny because that's what you think when you're a kid. And she says, Annie is here. And every time Maya hears her grandmother's name, she gets sad because she's like, she should be referred to as Mrs. Henderson, which is very sweet. And the dentist comes back to talk to them and says that he cannot serve Black people. He has a rule. And she says, look, I loaned you money, and I think you owe me a favor. And he said, well, I paid off that money. And she said, yes, but I was kind to you. You should be kind to me, basically. And he says, I would rather put my hand into a dog's mouth, which is like the worst thing I've ever heard. And she is so upset by this because she doesn't like to see her grandmother like disrespected like that, and this man is just so terrible. And her grandmother sends her to wait outside, and there's this whole scene where Maya imagines her grandmother going in and yelling at the dentist and like knocking him around. Obviously that's not what happened because we're in Maya's brain, but it's very cute to see her childlike assumption that her grandmother is just the most strong, beautiful person in the world. It's very sweet. We learn later that what actually happened was Mama made him pay $10 interest fee on the loan that he took out with her, and she used that money to pay the Black dentist to fix Maya's teeth. Next, we learn that Mama has made arrangements for Maya and Bailey to go to California and move away from stamps. Maya says Mama's really secretive, but she bet that the reason why that this is happening is because Bailey, a few weeks beforehand, had this thing where he came home really sad one day and wouldn't say why. And then after a while explained that he had been walking through town and this white man, a sheriff of some kind, I'm assuming, told him to help them carry this dead Black man out of the water. So I guess this Black man was just dead, and he helped carry him, and he looked terrible, and they put him in the paddy wagon with the other prisoners, and the sheriff like grinned at this black man who was dead. And it really left Bailey with some scars. And he says, why do the white people hate us so much? And Mama and Uncle Willy don't really have an answer, but they just say, you know, they don't hate us, they just don't know us, basically. And she thinks it has something to do with that, you know, event that happened that made Bailey feel so uncomfortable. The South might just not be a good place. She mentions Mama's getting older. She needs to take care of Uncle Willy. Those are all probably the reasons that had to do with why they're going to California. She makes them clothes and prepares them for the trip to go out there. Mama moves with them for a while and helps them settle in. And Maya mentions that later in life she realized how crazy that was for her mama to do that, because she was an old black woman from the southern town suddenly put into a new place farther than she'd ever been away from home. And she handled it just like it was no big deal, which is very adorable and like the sweetest thing. I love Mama. She's adorable. Anyway, her mother is there and they stay with their mother. She sleeps with her grandmother Baxter in her bed. And her mom is so sweet. They have like midnight parties with her where her mom makes them chocolate milk and wakes them up at 2 a.m. to like have dance parties. She gives some stories about her mother's past, and then she mentions that World War II has started. She also mentions that during this time, her mother marries Daddy Clydell, who is the first person in her life she thinks of as a father. Maya then tells us a bit about San Francisco and how it's changed because of World War II. She says that many of the Japanese stores were replaced by black businesses and black residents, and how Harlem was kind of built, and how she finally feels like she's part of a city. She talks about blending in there, about going to school. She went to one school first, but it was kind of janky, and then she went to a different school called George Washington School, where she was one of 3 black kids, which is crazy, and she had to take the train car there every day. She met a teacher who was called Mrs. Kerwin, and she said she was awesome and loved her. And she describes how she started taking drama and dance classes at the local college. They lived in a 14-room place with Daddy Clydell, and she mentions that his friends were all con men. And one of his friends, Redleg, once told her a story about how they set up and conned a white man for over $40,000. And she talks about how the displacement and adaptability of the black race demands a certain respect for those that can do better by any means necessary. It's very interesting. She delves in deep to culture and life and the black experience in a way that I've never read before, which is just so good. The next part of the book describes a vacation one summer that she took to her father's place. It's honestly a little long, but I'm running out of time, so I'm going to try and narrow it down a bit for you. She goes to her daddy's place in California expecting something mansion-y and big because he's really full of himself, and it's actually just a trailer park. He's dating this girl named Dolores who's really young and small and petty and rude, and they hate each other. Dolores does not like Maya. Maya does not like Dolores. And her father has these habits of going to Mexico during the nighttime. And one time he takes her with him. And they go to this fiesta in Mexico, and they drink, and she drinks Coca-Cola, but he drinks heavily. And he, spends the night with a Mexican lady, and she knows this, and he passes out drunk in the car that he drove them there in. And she decides that she's going to have to drive them home. Not knowing how to drive, she decides to give it her best shot and drives 50 miles to the border, where she accidentally crashes into another car. Basically, they're able to wake up her father. They're able to drive home in one piece. But when they get there, her father and Dolores have this huge argument about how she's getting in the way between Dolores and her father. That's Bailey Sr. And Bailey's like, you just have to get over it, okay? You're being a big bitch, and leaves. And feeling sorry for her, Maya comes out and says, look, Dolores, I never really mean to come in between you and my father. I apologize. And she basically calls her mother a whore because how did we get there? I don't know, but it degraded very quickly. And Maya responds by slapping her, and Dolores responds by attacking her and like grabbing her bodily and like hugging her closely. And Maya's able to shove away from her and run out the door. And Dolores follows her with a hammer. Maya jumps into her father's car, locks the doors, and hides herself, and realizes that somehow in the altercation she had been cut on her side. I'm not able to tell how bad the cut was, but she is bleeding enough that it's like pooling on the seat. So I don't know if Dolores was like holding a knife or something. How did that happen? I don't know, but she has a cut. Eventually her father hears the commotion and comes out and is like, stay in the car. And he talks to Dolores. He comes back out and sits with her in the car and says, what's going on? She's like, I got cut. And he's like, what? Where? And she's like, I just got cut. And so he drives her to a friend's house so that they can fix her up. And he leaves her with some friends. And I think that's the last straw for her. She's like, I have to get out of here. So she leaves. She leaves and she wanders around the city for the day, trying to decide what to do. She's not going to stay with him. She's not going to stay with the people he left her with. And she walks past this junkyard and sees this, pretty nice car just sitting there. Not like a Mercedes, but like a van that's not destroyed. And she crawls in and sleeps there for the night. In the morning, when she wakes up, she sees that there's this group of kids kind of staring at her. And she gets out and she realizes that it's this group of kids who all stay in the junkyard because their lives have been displaced by some reason. A boy named Bootsy kind of runs the group, and they each work odd jobs, and they all give the money to him communally, and they all stay in the junkyard in separate cars. And she stays with them for a month. She moves quickly through the timeline, but she just talks about how she really felt like she was one of them. She does a dance competition with her friend Juan, and they win second place. And after a month, she calls her mom to pull her out and to take her home. And she arrives home, and her mom gives her food made just for her, and it's like a strange new experience for her. Maya describes to us how now that she's home, it's very obvious that Bailey has changed too and grown up, and Mom and Bailey have this big fight, and then Bailey moves out. Now that Bailey's gone, she doesn't really know what to do with herself, so she decides, you know what, I'm gonna get a job. And thus, her goal of becoming a streetcar worker, the first Black streetcar worker, begins. And she works for 3 weeks, talking with different Black groups and talking with the city until she becomes the first Black streetcar worker. They give her terrible routines, but her mom is so supportive and picks her up at any time because she doesn't trust taxis. And she works there for a whole semester, very happy. What happens next in the story is she has her own sexual awakening. She starts reading this book, I forget what it's called, The Well of Loneliness, and it's her introduction to lesbianism, she says. And she reads it enough that she gets worried because she has a growth on her vagina, because she doesn't understand that this is just how vaginas work. And she worries she's turning into a lesbian. So she asks her mom, what's the matter with her? And her mom very kindly explains that it's just normal for a woman's body to do that, and that she's not a lesbian and that she's fine. Unfortunately, though, she's not comforted for very long because she has a girlfriend come over for a sleepover, and she removes her dress to change, and she is moved by the girl's body. Unfortunately, she doesn't realize at this age that she's moved by jealousy because she is not that, developed yet. But for her, she worries because all she knows is she felt emotion at a girl removing her clothes, and she worries again if she's a lesbian. She decides that the best way to fix this would be to get a boyfriend. So she enacts a very complicated plan, she tells us, of seduction for one of the boys nearby. There's these twin brothers, and one day she's walking by him, and he says, hello, Marguerite. And she says, do you want to have sexual intercourse with me? A very carefully well-laid plan. And he goes, okay. And so they do. And she finds that she's not very moved by it. It's kind of disappointing and quick, she says. But at the end of the day, she ends up worrying a little less about this until 3 weeks later, she realizes she's pregnant. She decides to keep the pregnancy a secret from her mother. She tells Bailey, and he tells her not to tell their mom because her mom, I guess she just can't be trusted. He says, don't tell mom. And she tells us she experiences nausea, but she stays in school. And 2 days after V-Day, she graduates, and she is now 8 months along, 8.5 months. She's very close to her due date, and her parents still have not noticed, and her classmates haven't noticed that she's pregnant. She must have hid this very well. And that night, she decides she'll leave a note for Daddy Clydell, and they realize that she's pregnant. And so they start getting her ready for birth. They take her to doctors and give her vitamins, and eventually she gives birth to her son. She says that it was a pretty easy labor because she decided that pain in labor was overrated, which is really funny. And she gives birth to him, and she thinks he's perfect, and she thinks that he's all hers. And she is just so happy, but she's scared of hurting him. She's scared to change his diaper. She's scared to sleep with him. She's scared she's gonna drop him or hurt him or do something wrong. And eventually her mom brings the baby to her bed one night while she's falling asleep and says, sleep with the baby. And she's like, no, I'm not gonna. And her mom says, yes. And she leaves the baby there. And eventually she falls asleep. And the morning after, her mom comes and wakes her up and says, look at the baby. And she's like, no, I can't. She's like scared. And she says, look at the baby. And she shows her how she is protecting the baby. She's put her arm over the child, but like not laid her arm down. She's like made a cover tent over the baby in her sleep. And so now she is, comforted by the fact that she's not going to hurt him. And she falls back asleep. And that is the end of the book, you guys. That's the end. Well, you guys, this story is literally so amazing. It's definitely one of my favorites, especially after rereading it. I think the second time it was even better than the first time because I knew what to expect and I was able to look at her writing more closely rather than just wondering what will happen next. And I'm blown away by her style and her ability to show me she's growing in her prose and also her ability to capture a feeling. It's just crazy. Now, honestly, there's not too much to analyze here, and I've gone over time a bit, but I'll tell you some of my thoughts and what I think the themes are of the book, because while this is based on her life, she had to choose certain memories to tell us. She didn't tell us her entire life story. I'm sure it would have ended up being more than 250 pages. So she had to choose and pick and choose which memories she wanted to give us. And I think the biggest themes in this book so far are themes of race, displacement, death, sexual awakenings, God, identity, and more, but I think race is a really big one there. And so is culture and like a people. Obviously, these are things that are really important to her that influence her decisions and have influenced her life. I think that she showed a crazy amount of vulnerability writing this story. There were things that she wrote down that she did not have to include. Like when she wrote down the initial times she was assaulted by Mr. Freeman, it surprised me only because it's so private and she obviously felt when she was younger like that was her fault. And so I thought it was so brave of her to write that down for the world to read, for her son to read, and just be okay with it. And her life story is so inspiring. She wrote 4 books in her last 10 years of her life. She passed away in 2014, which is really sad, but it's so crazy because she had the best life. And I think I'm going to continue reading her autobiographies when I have the chance because they're just so well done. And by the end of this book, I was learning words that I haven't heard of before. Whereas at the beginning, she's able to create a scene that doesn't make me feel like the writing is bad. She somehow still upgrades from that writing and gets better as she goes, which I wouldn't have thought is possible. I don't know. It's artistry, and I'm fangirling because she's amazing and she did so good, and I think everyone should read this book. It makes me curious why I was never required to read this in school. To be fair, I was never required to read To Kill a Mockingbird either, which is very famous, but compared to Kill a Mockingbird, I think we should read this one. This one is a more accurate telling of life in the South, in a Black town, and in Black life and culture, and the life that she experienced that was influenced by racism daily, So I don't know. I thought this is just as heartwarming and just as important, if not more so, since it's an autobiography. I don't know. I'm so shocked I wasn't required to read this, but I think everyone should in their lifetime because it was just so beautiful. I feel like I was reading a sunset. I don't know. It was enjoyable. And it's not boring either. All of the events are insane. The things that she's gone through in her life are utterly crazy to me, and they are confusing. And I feel like I don't remember what happened to me last week. And she's able to retain these images and memories so well. It's crazy. Like I said, I feel bad I don't have a lot of analysis for you. Mostly I just really enjoyed the book. And like I said, I see solid themes of coming-of-age stories, classic coming-of-age stories, finding her relationship with God, finding her relationship with the family around her, like finding her mom versus her mama versus Daddy Clydell versus the people in her life who didn't stay for very long. Like, this is a story about a girl who adapts to the world around her as best as she can, and along the way tries to find out what is the real her. Which city responds to her best? Where does she feel at home? What makes her feel at home? Bailey does that. She calls herself Maya just because of him. She loves her family. She loves her mother. And she even loves her dad despite his craziness. And I don't know, it's a really inspiring story, and I really enjoyed it. And if you want to read a story about awakenings of all kinds, of finding your way in a world that's not built for you and things like that, I think this is the story you should turn to because it's just awesome. So I am really sorry that I talked your ear off for over an hour now about this, and that at the very end, I really only could tell you about the themes. This is one of those things where if it was fiction, I feel like I could tell you a bit more, but I'm a bit unpracticed when it comes to nonfiction. If you feel like you have a lot to say about it, let me know when you're finished reading it, if you ever do, because I'd be so interested to hear what you have to say. This is a book that I feel like I was just along for the ride, this is her life story. Of course, she chose to show me certain themes, but this is just her story. I was just here to listen to it. And while I could have analyzed it deeper, I didn't really want to. I thought it was just nice to experience. But I really do recommend this book. And you got to experience it a little bit with me, which I thought was so fun that I got to tell you about all the crazy things that happened to her. So thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that you had a lovely Tuesday and a lovely evening. And thank you so much. I'm just so happy I got to talk to you guys about this because I was fangirling the entire time I was reading it. If you want more Bad Book Club, you can follow us on our social media at Bad Book Club Pod. You can also buy a book from my bookshop. You can read I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings and support a local bookstore and also the podcast if you like. And lastly, please subscribe and review to the podcast. It really helps me get out there and get noticed by more people. And I hope you guys just have a great day. So I'll see you next week, where we're going to actually be talking about Life of Pi, which is really fun. I've seen the movie. I've never read the book. So I'll see you next week. Have a great day. Bye, lovelies.